Or
And hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Grading for Impact, Raising Student Achievement Through a Target-Based Assessment and Learning System. First off, before we start, I just want to let everyone know that you can ask questions using the chat function. So if you have a question, please ask it when the question pops into your head. Ask it in context, and we will do our best to get to that question as soon as possible. So please go ahead and ask questions when you think of them and use the chat function to ask questions. Now on to the webinar. I'd like to pass our virtual microphone over to Nicole Franks, Associate Director of Marketing for Corwin, who will introduce our presenters today.
Thank you, Jeff. Today's webinar is on raising student achievement through a target-based assessment and learning system. Educational systems continue to look for ways to maximize learning, increase achievement, and provide honest and accurate results to students and families as they relate to both academic and behavioral expectations. Today, Tom Hierck and Garth Larson will report on one method that provides educators with a practical way to achieve these goals: target-based assessment, grading, and reporting. Today, you're in for a treat. You'll learn how to use target-based assessment, grading, and reporting to provide students with feedback, our ultimate goal. Discover how to identify academic and behavioral targets through analyzing learning standards, and gain some really practical tools that you can use and take away after joining us today. I'll be live tweeting during the webinar, so please follow us at Corwin Press. You can also follow Garth Larson at Larson Garth and Tom Hierck at T Hierck. Now, let me go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. Tom Hierck has been an educator since 1983 in a career that has spanned all grade levels and roles in public education. And I know after talking to him that this is absolutely true. He's a wonderful person to sit down with and talk about his experience as a teacher, administrator, district leader, Department of Education project leader, and executive director, which has provided the context for his education philosophy. He presents throughout the world, primarily in North America, with a message of celebration for educators seeking to make a difference in the lives of students. He explores the importance of positive learning environments and the role of assessment to improve student learning. And his belief that every student is a success story waiting to be told has led him to work with teachers and administrators to create positive school cultures and build effective relationships that facilitate learning for all students. Tom has worked with district and division leaders as well as school leaders on the design and implementation of structures and programs that promote effective practice and produce positive results. And I know he just came from one such meeting in order to be here with us today. We thank him for being here, and we're excited to hear about what he has to share with us. Garth Larson is the K-12 Director of Learning for the Winnicott Community School District in Northeast Wisconsin. I may have pronounced that incorrectly, so you'll have to correct me, Garth. And also serves as President of First Educational Resources. He just completed his doctorate in educational leadership at the University of Wisconsin, Oshkosh, and he sits on the board of directors for ASCD Wisconsin, as well as the K-12 Advisory Council for Education for the University of Wisconsin at Oshkosh, and also serves as an adjunct faculty member for educational courses that are offered through Dominican University of California, as well as the University of Wisconsin at Oshkosh. Garth has previously worked as an elementary principal in 2 Wisconsin school districts and started his career in education as a high school speech and English teacher, a man after my very own heart. In 2011, Garth formed First Educational Resources with a focus of improving student achievement across the U.S. And since 2011, over 800 school districts throughout the country have become partnership districts with his company. Garth currently consults to school districts around the country and provides custom professional development around a variety of topics, mainly PLCs, RTI and MTSS, grading and reporting, and school improvement. We're so excited to hear from both of these gentlemen today as they share with us tools for grading for impact.
Well, thank you, Nicole, for the introduction. And I'll just clarify, it is the Winnicott Community School District, but not, you're close, in Northeast Wisconsin. So first of all, thank you so much for join Tom and I for this next hour. The way we kind of set up the webinar today is to spend about 45 minutes going through a little bit of content, sharing a little bit of the why, the how, and the what. And then we really want to also give the opportunity for participants to ask questions. You know, I've been studying this for quite a while now. I know Tom has done a ton of work in the grading, assessment, and reporting arena. And there's really not a more emotional topic in education today than this. And so we want to make sure that we give you plenty of time to ask the questions, to you know, potentially challenge our thinking and each other's thinking, to make sure that when it's all said and done, that you feel that this time was definitely worth your value of investing in what we have to say. So appreciate the introduction. The only thing I'll add to it, and then if Tom wants to add anything as well, is happy to also inform you that I have two beautiful, loving children, Jackson and Maddie. Jackson just finished on Friday 3rd grade, and Maddie just finished 1st grade. And the only reason why I want to share that is when we look at things like grading, assessment, reporting, anything that we're going to be talking about today is exactly what I would want for my own children. We want nothing but the best educational opportunities for every single kid that enters a school system, regardless of where it is throughout the entire world. And we truly believe that this work is a step in the right direction to help get there. So, you know, besides the educational aspect, I am married to my beautiful wife, Tammy, and we have our 2 children. Tom, do you want to add anything at all?
Yeah, I think, you know, that latter point, Garth, is really why. And we hope this will be a great collegial discussion. We're motivated. You know, I'm obviously at the other end of the spectrum. Garth is young enough to be my child. And so I'm talking about my grandbabies. You know, and same thing. I want them to have an outstanding education system. I want them to have a different school, a different experience than the one I had. I believe we've got to be creating schools for kids' futures, not parents' past. And so this work does matter. It matters for us because of our personal connections. It matters for us because we get a chance to work with our colleagues. And as Garth alluded to, we reserve the right to get smarter. And we know we will by your participation, by the questions you might ask, by your analysis of the book we put together, and the opportunity to come out and work with you. So we're hoping all of this leads to at least a nudge in the next direction about talking about assessment practice.
So with that being said, we want to jump into a little bit of why, as a participant in this webinar, or as a potential participant in reading our book, or coming to one of our workshops, or having us work with your district, you know, why would we invest? There are a lot of really great resources out there on assessment, on grading, on reporting. I think one thing that makes this book a little bit unique and a little bit different is the practicality behind it and the intentionality in how we try to simplify things, so that districts throughout, you know, throughout the U.S., throughout the world, can actually take this information and put it into practice. Because, you know, that's ultimately the goal when you put together any type of publication or any type of presentation, is you want it to be meaningful, you want it to have impact, and you want it to actually be applicable. And that's really what we feel we've done with this. So when we jump into this, we were very fortunate enough to have Myron Dueck write the foreword to the book. Those of you that are familiar with Myron, he's also out of BC, just like Tom, in Canada, but wrote the book Grading Smarter, Not Harder, which also I believe is a very practical book. And so when we asked Myron to write the foreword and he started reading through the information that we had to provide, we pulled a little bit from the foreword just to kind of get us in the mindset of what we're looking at when we think about grading for impact. And so as you can see, you know, he starts by talking about how we like to make excuses, especially in education in general, when something might be a little bit uncomfortable, when something might not look the same as it always did. And so, you know, these are some samples that Myron's heard, that Tom and I have heard. You know, this is all great, but it doesn't work at my level, so let's just let another school try it. Or, you know, it's never been done before, so we don't want to be the first to fail. Let's let somebody else take this on, let them go through the failure process, and then we'll maybe try it. Or, you know, I just don't know what it will look like, so I'll wait a few years for more information to come out. Or I just don't have time to change. And these are all excuses that Tom and I have heard along the way, amongst others. And Tom, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that a little bit.
I think we get to this place where, and as we would see with kids, sometimes the rationale isn't so much about not wanting to, as perhaps just beneath that surface, I'm not sure I know how to. And I think part of this conversation, when we get to talking about assessment, is that desire, that ability to be part of the team and to, on some levels, be vulnerable, right? We have to be willing to try some things that we know might lead to better outcomes. That's not meant to be an evaluation of your current system, but unless we are getting to and working as hard as we possibly can to gather evidence on 100% of our kids and working towards their success, we have to be open to new methods. Lots of times the resistance is, on some levels, more speaking to, I'm not sure I have the capacity yet to get there. And so colleague to colleague again, let's make sure we build people's collective capacity and efficacy to carry forward on this work.
So with that being said, as Myron kind of talks about in the forward and kind of works through some of these excuses, he also provides this. If these excuses were quarterbacks, Hierck and Larson would have sacked them all. And I apologize for any New England fans that might be joining us today. As you heard, I am from Wisconsin, and so this just seems like a fitting picture for the notion of sacking the quarterbacks. But ultimately, our entire goal, and this is what Myron kind of alludes to, is that Grading for Impact handles each step of that transformation. We talk about the why the change is needed, but then more importantly, because I think there has been a lot of conversations, whether we're talking about elementary, middle school, or high schools, all over the U.S. and all over the world, that have had a lot of conversations on why the change is needed. But where they really run into roadblocks is show me how it can be done and show me some evidence that it actually worked on behalf of kids. And so that's really what our goal is as we move forward. So we're going to start with a little bit of information from a student that actually is the introductory section to the book. And so we're going to give you just a second to kind of read through this in terms of, this is from a 12th grade student at Winneconne High School in Winneconne, Wisconsin, giving her perspective on why target-based assessment, grading, and reporting was beneficial to her. So we're just going to give you a little bit of time. We just want you to get in that mindset from a student lens of how students kind of view a change in how we assess them, how we give them feedback, etc. And just so you know, you also will get access to all of these slides. So, as we go through, if something we didn't spend enough time on it, you will be able to also see some of this information. And again, we will get you this information again. You'll have access to it. And then this is how Morgan, the 12th grade student at Winneconne High School, summed it all up. And I think the part that we're most proud of in relationship to this work is kind of one of those last lines where it says, within this year, I've noticed myself asking for more help, discussing topics in future detail, and visualizing what I am learning. And really, isn't that our role as educators, is to put our students in that position for success. And so when we talk about grading for impact, when we talk about target-based grading, assessment, reporting, etc., this encompasses everything that we're trying to accomplish for our students to be able to own their learning. So the other thing we want to do then is show a little bit of impact. If the title of the book is Grading for Impact, show that there's actually been impact on what's happened in relationship to student learning. So I'm going to share a little bit. Again, as Nicole mentioned, I am the part-time K-12 Director of Learning for the Winneconne Community School District in Northeast Wisconsin. And I'm going to show you a little bit of our journey. And the thing to point out, and Tom will emphasize this as well as we go, is that this is a journey. And there is no one perfect system out there. There's no one right way or wrong way to do this. So when we talk about this, I'll share with you some of the processes that we followed, some of the successes that we had. But each district, and Tom and I talk about this with every district we work with, has to be able to figure out how to put their own unique perspective on this. Because you can't just take something and fully replicate it because it's not your own. but we're going to show some of the things that have worked well. So if you can take some modifications and some tweaks to it to make it work for your district, then we consider this time worthwhile and a success. So several years ago, we embarked on this journey. What you're looking at in Winneconne, this was our district improvement plan. It was one page. And we realized that there were so many initiatives going on that if we really wanted our teachers to invest in something and actually be able to feel like, you know what, we can put forth full effort into this because we know it's not going away, we needed to simplify and we needed to have a clear focus. We needed to provide clarity. And so we embarked on this journey back starting in 2014. And you can see there were 4 key areas that we were focusing on. Educator effectiveness was something that at the time the state of Wisconsin indicated we had to do. District-wide literacy was driven by our Board of Education. And then the bottom 2, our PLC and RTI framework and our grading and reporting really became the focal point for everything that we were doing. And so with today, obviously, we're focusing more on the assessment, grading, and reporting. But please know, as I show some of the results, that we really believe it's dependent on the other areas as well. Assessment, grading, and reporting isn't just about a report card, isn't just about solely giving feedback. It's about improving our learning structures. And so, please keep that in mind as you're looking at some of the details. In Wisconsin, sorry, go ahead, Ken. Or Tom.
And so keeping your plan as that key focal point. If you look at a one-page document, far too often we are working in environments where there are way too many and very broad goals that in essence, most of our time is spent talking about what we're going to do in regards to those goals and actually never getting to those goals. Keeping that over an extended period of time. We continually reference a 3 to 5 year period if we're going to make authentic, meaningful change that your whole team will own. We've got to get away from the flavor of the month, the pursuit of whatever somebody went to and heard about, versus how about some long-term sustainable planning that leads towards all students achieving. The next set of slides that Garth's going to walk you through start to validate this process over time.
So in the state of Wisconsin, every year districts receive what are called school report card ratings, and each state has their own kind of unique way of doing this. And so there's kind of 2 numbers to focus on. The first one initially is just kind of the number that's circled on the left there, 72.3 meets expectations. So this was prior to us really taking on. Now, there had been conversations happening around knowing that we needed to change our ways of assessment, our ways of instruction. But there were a lot of things that we really hadn't put in place. It was just kind of the initial part of the conversation. And so as we started to put some of this information into place, we started to see a little bit of a change. So this was our score pre, 72.3. We were meeting expectations. We were doing fine. We were kind of in the middle of the state in terms of our districts and doing okay. And we could have been happy with that, but we knew that our students deserved better. And so in the first year of implementation, we were very similar to the year before. Again, you're not going to see this automatic change happen overnight, but we knew that the conversations we were having were the right conversations. We knew the focus that we had was the right focus. And ultimately, we knew we had to continue to invest in this work. And so between 2014 and 15, due to a couple of reasons politically in the state of Wisconsin, school report cards were not released that year. So there was a full gap between what you're currently seeing and the next time that they were released. Now, we continued to keep the focus on those 4 key areas. We continued to keep the focus on making sure that we had sound assessment, grading, and reporting practices in place. And here's where we jumped to in 2015-16. Again, now moved up to 83.3, significantly exceeds expectations. And at that time, we were one of the only K-12 districts in our entire 42 district region that had accomplished such goals. The thing that I also want to highlight is it's not only the score on the left, but if you see on the screen, there's a part that says student growth. So it goes student achievement and student growth. That's where our focus was. That's where we really looked at this process of how our students were performing and how our assessment practices were taking place to say, are we growing kids? And so when you look at that score of 98.2, that's what we were the most proud of, which means no matter where they came to us, whatever level they came, whether they were below level, on level, or above level, we were growing them. And that's really what this system is designed to do. Now, again, we kept the same focus and we said, we know we can continue to get better. And here's where we ended up last year at the end of the 2016-17 school year, 89.3 significantly exceeds expectations. And we're the 4th highest rated K-12 school district in the entire state of Wisconsin out of 420. And so we show that not to just say, well, look at us, we're great. We show that to say there is impact associated with what we're talking about. And I've personally have seen it firsthand. I've seen it not only change how our students are doing on assessment scores, because that's not what this is about. The assessment scores are nothing more than validation in the changing of the learning systems that we've put in place. And so hopefully this gives you a little bit of a reason to invest in what we're talking through, because there has been a high level of impact as a result. So jumping ahead, let's get into a little bit of what grading for impact really is. And through our work, and as Tom and I kind of sat down and we've looked at all the previous literature and we've looked at what we've been doing in districts we've been working with, we've tried to narrow it down to kind of 4 key principles. The first one is this notion that formative practice, so things like homework, things like quizzes, in some cases labs, whatever it may be, formative practice is not counted as a part of that academic grade, because it's truly meant to be formative. It's meant to guide our instructional practices. The moment that we start to put any type of number associated with that, even if it's the smallest percent, I've seen districts say, well, we just count it for a little bit. The moment that you put any type of numerical value, it's no longer formative. You've now changed its intent.
So let's make sure again, and recently, like less than a month ago, there was still some confusion about what is intended by formative practice. Formative is anything we do along the way that guides, that informs my teaching practice, the students' learning outcomes. But if it is recorded in a grade book unalterable, it is no longer formative. Formative is not indicative of when you assessed the kid. It is not formative because you did it in the second week of a 5-week unit. If it is permanently etched in a grade book, it has become summative. Formative means we are using it to guide what happens next.
The second key principle then is this notion of reassessment, meaning that, if students aren't there yet, that we give them the opportunity to go through a process to be able to get them there, and without penalty. And I think that's kind of a key part is we've seen too many schools that will look at reassessment and say, okay, yeah, we'll give them another chance. But you know what? They don't have the same opportunity as the kids that got it the first time. And what we're saying is reassessment is reassessment. Sometimes it takes a little bit more support to get our kids there. Yet in the end, if we're really about giving accurate measures of what students have learned and what they're able to do with that learning, they deserve to make sure that the way that is reported is the same as all other students.
We have to decide and be really clear on, is it about the learning or is it about the earning? If you as a teacher decide what every kid needs to know, the objective then must be that every kid knows it. Have to be willing to accept, therefore, that some kids might need more time or a different approach. We have to stop valuing only first-time smart and having penalties for anything that comes after that. You're not going to get the same grade if you are subsequent smart than you would get if you were first-time smart. This has got to be about kids achieving the desired outcomes and us working to endeavor that occurs.
The third key principle then within grading for impact is this notion of separating non-academic factors. And so sometimes, you hear, well, non-academic factors shouldn't be counted in a grade. And we 100% agree with that. We think that a grade should be truly representative of what students know and can do. Yet there are still other things that are incredibly important, such as employability skills, life skills, behaviors, those types of things. And so within a grading for impact system, those life skills and behaviors are separated from the academic achievement and then also reported in some way, shape, or form via report cards, and even in our case, in our district, on transcripts as well at the high school level. The fourth and final...
great information for students and their parents to have.
Yep. The fourth and final key area of grading for impact is this notion of proficiency. And so that when we look at how we communicate student achievement, how we communicate student performance, that it is truly based on student proficiency against clearly designed learning intentions. So in our case, very clearly specific learning targets that have been identified through a very specific process, and that we assess, give feedback, and use as the basis for how we communicate that achievement. So again, when we kind of put it all together, what is grading for impact? It's these 4 key areas. Formative practice is not a part of the academic grade. Reassessments allowed on all summative assessments without penalty. Non-academic factors are removed and reported separately, and that we use student proficiency against specific learning targets as the basis for what determines a student's academic grade. So with that being said, how do we start having the conversations? How do we begin? Now, some of you might be a little bit further in the journey. Some of you might just be beginning. Here's what I know. We're 5 years into that journey in our district, elementary, middle school, and high school, and we're still having the conversations. So, and I would consider that we've gone through this process and have had spent significant time working through it. The conversations never stop. Now, they might look a little different. We might have implemented something a certain way, but we want to make sure if we don't continue to revisit and have the conversations, our students are not going to benefit the way that they could. So that's where we're going to kind of get into some of these key areas, and this is what we talk about in the book. So the first thing is, what's the purpose of formative practice? So, when we look at that, like everything is going to come down to, and Tom will elaborate on this a little bit, because a lot of Tom's work is very much about being purpose-driven and understanding our purpose. And if we take that context in everything that we do, when we talk through these 4 key areas, when we focus on purpose and we know our why, the what has more impact.
Yeah, I have no doubt that every educator begins their class, their instructional design with the intention of every kid learning. When we sit down and talk with folks, the purpose is always clear. We've identified what every kid needs to know. We've come up with some strategies that we think work. So that's not the hurdle that needs to be cleared. The hurdle that needs to be cleared is when you start to gather evidence from our formative practice that indicates some kids aren't learning, what are you prepared to do next? This is not a woe is me moment, I must be a terrible educator. This is, hey, what I did worked for a lot of kids, but I've got some kids for whom it didn't work. I know they need to get this. Formative practice is about informing what happens next. Instructionally, I've got to be able to go to my colleagues and say, listen, I tried, we agreed to, it didn't work for these kids. What else have we got? I've got to sit down and look at every kid and their learning style. And again, what is it that I need to do differently? I bet everyone who is in on this webinar has had that day, that moment where the lesson just flowed brilliantly and you went home almost dancing, so excited. Best lesson you ever taught. And next year you give that same lesson and it's like crickets in the room. It wasn't a bad lesson. It's just everything else around you has changed. You've changed, the kids have changed, something else is going on. Formative gives me the evidence about what I need to do next.
So with that being said, we have a couple of resources that can help push that conversation that we allude to in the book and really has helped us get to the point of where we need to be. So as mentioned earlier, Myron Dueck's Grading Smarter, Not Harder, he gives some points to take into consideration. And as we were working through this in our district, we said, you know what, if we can agree to any one of these statements on the screen, we have enough of a rationale to say, you know what, homework should no longer be a part of our grade. I mean, it really shouldn't. Homework should be about that formative practice. It should be about, giving them the feedback, because ultimately what we want is we want our students to be able to give their own authentic work. So we truly know where they are in their learning. Now, I've seen too many times where students do so well on the homework, and then they come to any type of assessment, whether it be a formative assessment or the summative assessment toward the end of a unit, or when that teacher is ready to assess it and say, I did so well on the homework, why can I not do so well on the assessments? And part of that is because the homework has been very much about getting the points and not about the learning. And so we've said we need to make sure that they truly give us that authentic learning so we can give them the right feedback. So, after today, use these questions, work through that and have conversations in your buildings to say, okay, if we can all agree that grading homework perpetuates the disadvantages faced by lower income students, then why are we doing it? Yeah. And we have to move past this notion of it's because it's what we've always done.
And I think most teachers will know in their instruction which kids got it, which kids kind of got it, and which kids have no idea. And yet we give all those kids, if I simplified it by giving you 3 different groupings, we give them all the same homework. The kids who already demonstrated proficiency in class don't need it. The kids who have no idea how to demonstrate proficiency aren't going to get it. And so again, the question is, who are we doing this for? What is your intention? What's your purpose?
Which actually takes us into some really good points that Tom Schimmer talks about in his book, Grading from the Inside Out, which is, all right, well, if we're not going to grade it, let's repurpose it. Because we're not questioning the value of practice. Practice is incredibly important for our students. But we should ask ourselves some questions as we're going through the process of assigning practice and that type of thing, which is, asking these questions. Is it learning-centered? Is it necessary? Is it reasonable? Is it high quality? So is it really going to help move their learning forward? Are the students ready, and are they involved? And so these are questions that we encourage you to use to be able to work through this, because ultimately, if we're going to get to the point where formative practice is no longer a part of the grade, then we also want to make sure that we get to the point where our teachers understand the necessary side of how do we have these conversations to make sure that it still gets impact when they're given that practice. So then how do we still hold them accountable? Because what we've heard is, okay, if we're not going to have the dangling carrots and give them a grade, how do we still hold them accountable then to make sure they're doing that work? And there are a variety of ways of doing that. A way that we work through it was partially tied to principle number 3, which was, removing non-academic factors and communicating and reporting those separately. So what you're looking at right now is you're looking at the Winneconne High School conduct rubric. And so because we are the Winneconne Wolves and we are incredibly creative, we have what's called PAW. And PAW is tied to our PBIS language that came out of the elementary. And so what that stands for is practice, kindness, always show respect, and work to do your best. So when we look at the notion of work to do your best, we broke that into 3 different areas: academic honesty, prepared to learn, and striving for excellence. So if a student really needs that practice, if they really need to engage in that because they're not yet proficient on that, and we work with them to make sure they understand the importance of the practice and they still don't do it, this is where we hold them accountable. We've shifted where the accountability lies, because again, we give them some type of communication in relationship to how they're doing on that. So in this case, if they're not doing their homework, obviously they're not coming prepared. So if they're continually following this pattern, we would hold them accountable under that work to do your best score. And again, toward the end of the webinar, I'll show you what that looks like in terms of the reporting side of things. The next principle then is this notion of reassessment, and the thing that kind of gets to both Tom and I is this notion of conversations around the real world. That's why we have this on here. This is actually the real world that you see on the screen right now. But yet we always use this idea of, yes, but in the real world, you don't get second chances. Well, or in college, you don't get second chances. Which college are you talking about? I know a lot of universities that now allow for reassessment to occur. A lot of occupations that allow for that to occur. So it always, again, starts with this notion of the purpose of reassessment. If our goal is to ensure that every single kid learns at the highest level, that every single kid from the time they come in 3-year-old kindergarten, 4-year-old kindergarten, 5-year-old kindergarten, whatever your system may have, from the time they leave in to the time they leave as 12th graders, or even after that for some of our students, we want to make sure that we put them in a position for success. And so too often we say, well, you don't get a second chance because we want to prepare you for what post-high school life is going to be like. And so our point is, are we better preparing our students by sending them off into whatever post-high school looks like for them with bigger gaps in their learning because we said we wanted to teach you a lesson on the forefront? To us, it just doesn't make sense, because ultimately our goal is to make sure they learn as much as possible when they are with us. Tom,
so are we going to focus on gathering evidence, or are we going to focus on gathering numbers? Because part of the challenge we hear on reassessment is it does something to the numbers. Garth came in and got 90% at the outset. Tom got 50%. It's not fair if Tom gets another chance and gets 90%, because somehow that invalidates Garth's 90%. And so we have to come up with some mathematical formulation to let Tom know that although he has achieved at a very high level, there's a penalty for not getting it right away based on the best method of being taught. Again, if we believe it's about the learning, that kids get it, then we ought to make that the focus.
So a prime example, just to share recently, I was on a flight recently to Columbus, Ohio, and as I was flying from O'Hare down to Columbus, the gentleman sitting next to me on the plane had this book that you see a picture of right now, the police exam preparation book. And so I started having a conversation with him. It was a younger gentleman, and I said, well, when do you take your exam? He said, well, I actually just took it a week ago, and unfortunately I didn't pass. So I said, I'm sorry to hear that. But I said, obviously you're studying. Do you get a second chance? And he said, yes, I'm going to be able to take it again next week. So I'm working through and trying to figure out what I didn't know. I said, well, that's really cool. I said, do you mind if I take a picture of the book? He thought it was a little weird at that point. But ultimately I explained to him how I work with educators on understanding the importance of, on big things that matter in life. We're given multiple opportunities. For this particular young man, it didn't matter that he didn't know all of the rules and regulations of becoming a police officer the first time around. All that matters is that eventually he gets to that point so he can protect us on the streets, protect society, and he knows what that looks like as a police officer. And so, in their case, I said, well, what is the time frame? He said, we have 3 weeks, and then we can take it again. I said, and if you fail, he said, then another 3 weeks. So there is some type of new learning that has to occur. There is a little bit of a waiting period, but ultimately, he had the same opportunity. We can use every example and imaginable, from pilots to lawyers to us as educators getting second chances. It happens all the time. So why wouldn't we give that same opportunity to our students? So one of the questions that commonly comes up then is, how do we still hold our students accountable to make sure they try the first time? Now, I will say this, when we moved to reassessment practices in Winneconne 4 years ago, it didn't go well. We didn't have the right measures in place. We didn't have certain pieces, certain processes that needed to be followed. And so we would have students, because they are kids and they will take advantage of the system. We had students that would take advantage of the system, and some of our highest performing students. Some kids would have an AP bio test and an AP physics test the same day. And they'd say, you know what, I can reassess. So they wouldn't even focus on the one. They would come into class, they'd write reassess on the top of it and turn it right back in. And as you could imagine, our teachers were pretty frustrated with that. So we had to put some new measures in place to make sure there was still a level of accountability, but to still keep the window of opportunity open for our students. So one of our saving graces was the reassessment tickets. And so what you see on the screen is, when students go through the reassessment process, there has to be some reflection on it. And this is from one department, this is from our science department. Other departments have some other type things that they use similar. But ultimately, what we want you to understand is it's okay to have a process. So as you can see, the student needs to reflect on why they didn't meet the targets on the assessment. What was it that they weren't prepared for? But more importantly, what is your new evidence of learning? What did you do to prepare for the reassessment this time around? Our math department, for example, if students have missing practice specifically tied to a target they're not yet proficient on, they need to do that practice. Once they do that practice, then they can give them the feedback. So then they know that the students are in a better position for success the next time around. And so there are things that we want to put in place to ensure that, they give that right effort the first time, they've done things, but then what is your new evidence of learning? This has helped our teachers immensely in working through the reassessment process.
And so there has to be, some basic principles in place. Number one, you gave me your best effort the first time. Number two, you have some new learning. Number three, here's a great real world example. We always mention real world to the kids in a fairly threatening, negative fashion. I think it's part of the reason why some of our grade 12s don't really want to graduate. We have not presented the real world to be a pleasant place to go to. But here's a great real world example. If I, after I run a race, need to go for a massage, I must book an appointment. You as educators are professionals. If a child needs to come see you for some additional reteach time, some more learning, they should book an appointment. And you should give them an appointment card like they would get in the real world. And they should show up for their appointment and get their 20 minutes of reteach and make the decision at the end of that appointment. Are they ready to do the reassessment, in which case I'll give them an appointment card for reassessment. If they're not ready, I'll give them a second follow-up appointment to get them ready. We can make real-world examples that are authentic, not real-world examples that are intended to intimidate and scare people off.
So a prime example as we wrap up the reassessment side of things, what you're looking at is a picture from not last Friday night, but the Friday night before Memorial Weekend from our high school graduation in Winneconne. And we had 5 valedictorians this year, and they all decided to give a speech together at the same time. And for me, this was a culminating moment of the work that's been done in our district and our students understanding the process. The speech was actually through the lens of a retake. All 5 students talked about 5 key characteristics in life, but then took a spin on it through this notion of reassessment, from failure to perseverance to success to growth to future. And as I was sitting and watching them talk through this, it was finally that moment where, okay, they fully understand why we give them second chances and how important it is to look at that for what that looks like beyond high school in everything that we do in life. Because again, it's all about how we respond when we don't do as well as we'd like to the first time. And so, students do wrap their minds around this, but again, it takes time, as Tom mentioned, when we talk about, the time associated with these conversations. The third and the fourth key principles kind of flow together in terms of making sure that our grades are accurate, making sure that we remove those non-academic factors as a part of how we go about communicating student achievement. So we're going to talk through a little bit about, purpose of grading. And for our district, it really came down to this. A grade was nothing more than a way to communicate achievement at a point in time. How are our kids doing against our targets? And what do they need to do next to be able to learn at higher levels? And that really became our focal point. Too often, when we talk about grading, we go out, we look at a report card, and we start with a report card first. Don't start with a report card first. A report card is nothing more than a communication tool. Start with what you want students to learn. Start with ways to measure whether or not they're learning. Start with how are you going to respond to students who are struggling or students that really need to be taken to that next level. And then determine after that's all said and done, here's how we want to communicate that to mom, dad, students, etc. So you always have to start with that purpose. Tom Gusky always talks about clarify the purpose of grading and then figure out how you're going to go about communicating that. So what we're going to show you is again, this is an example. This is a part of what we highlight in the book in terms of the book being kind of an embedded case study of some things that we did in Winneconne and some other districts. But really this gets to this notion of target-based assessment and grading. And we'll kind of talk through the proficiency values. So as we move forward, there are a couple of key things when we look at grading for impact and kind of the lens that Tom and I took in this book versus maybe some other books. First and foremost, when we look at this, we assess and grade on learning targets, not on the academic standards as a whole. And part of the rationale for this and the reason behind this was through a lot of conversations, not only in our own district, but as we started to have conversations with other districts, that I believe that we all can agree that sometimes academic standards are very broad and confusing, both for parents, for students, and quite honestly, sometimes for us as the educators. The standards are not necessarily written in language that's fully easy to wrap our minds around. Now, they are a great starting point. So we take those standards and we break them down into clearly stated objectives, learning targets for what students should be able to know and do in a given class. And so again, the process that we talk about in the book is we go through, we prioritize the standards, we find out what is the most critically important to use. And then once we have those standards prioritized, then we write very clear and specific learning targets on what we want to assess and provide feedback on. So I'm going to show you some examples here. These are some sample elementary learning targets. Okay, students able to talk about characters, problems, and events in the story. Now, in a target-based system, we are going to assess specifically proficiency levels on each one of these targets. Again, not the standard as a whole. Some sample secondary learning targets. Students able to compare and contrast the Bohr and quantum mechanical models of the atom, or compare and contrast wildlife species. And also, let's not forget behavioral targets, because this system isn't just about the academic side. This is about the whole child. This is about the behavior as well. So a student routinely completes and returns assigned work, shows respect for peers, adults, property, etc. So again, these are samples, and I want to show you how then we took that and organized that. So this is all done in Google. What I'm going to show you right now is all done in Google, all linked in Google. It was something that we did in Winneconne that was a way for our teachers to go through this process. So if you are a grade 1 teacher in our district and you're teaching literature, these are our learning targets, or as you can see on the left, our proficiency targets of what we expect a student to do in grade 1 for literature. Now you will see that some of them may look similar to the standard and some of them might have a little bit of a different language or a little bit of a different feel. Now the one thing I just want to clarify is you're looking through these documents, the number to the right of the document is not a standard, that is an internal numbering system. So what you would see under ask and answer explicit questions about a fictional text, that stands for reading literature grade 1 target 1, reading literature grade 1 target 2. So these 5 targets are what our focal point are going to be around literature in grade 1 and making sure that every single kid gets and that we put the right measures in place. This is also what we provide feedback to our parents on. We have a heavy emphasis on writing in our district. So here's an example from grade 4 writing in which there are 13 targets associated with grade 4 writing that we are going to be able to provide feedback and proficiency values in relationship to. Here's an example of how we have math created. Again, math is organized by domain. Here's grade 2 for operations and algebraic thinking. We have 6 targets. And again, those targets become the basis for our assessment design, become the basis for how we communicate achievement, but really become the basis for how our instructional design occurs in our classroom on a daily basis. Here's an example from grade 5 geometry. Again, 8 learning targets affiliated with it. These are going to be the ones that we're ensuring that all kids get and that we're putting the right supports in place and giving that feedback on. Moving along into secondary, some of our secondary teachers, after prioritizing our standards and writing our targets, decided to organize them by unit of instruction. So this is from our middle school social studies, 8th grade social studies. Let's say that the first unit is America's First Colonies. These are the learning targets that are affiliated with America's First Colonies. And again, I want to emphasize, when we look at this, the target, so if you're looking at explain the reasoning for colonial settlement in the New World, FC.1, that target is going to be assessed and going to get a proficiency value. In a previous, more traditional model, you would get a system where you would get a score on America's First Colonies for the whole overall assessment. That doesn't occur in a target-based system. What happens is they may have an assessment at the end of the unit, but each one of those assessments is measured and given a proficiency value. So in this case, you would get 6 different scores plus a score on whether or not they're able to analyze primary sources. So that's a bigger difference versus a traditional model. Moving along into the high school, this is a science example of how science is kind of mapped. And these are just screenshots of it, but obviously in this case for chemistry 1, and we show this because this is about the most extreme you would see. There are 9 learning targets associated with atomic and electronic structure. Each one of those carries a proficiency value of proficient, approaching proficient, or need support, or in a numbering system, 3, 2, or 1. Now in this case, the teacher would probably take this assessment and not do all 9 on the same summative, might break it up into 2 or 3 different summative assessments. Again, here's how it is for our agriculture and natural science courses. These are targets that are affiliated with this particular standard, apply scientific principles to natural resource management activities. So again, the goal is, and there are a bunch of examples in the book, and there are examples of how you can find these. I'm going to walk you through that in just an example, or in a second. This is from math, so it goes all the way. We can show you what this looks like all the way up to calculus, and again, how those targets are written. If you want to find any of our targets, they are online. As you can see on the screen, Winneconne Community School District, if you type that into your browser, it'll take you, and you can click on the district webpage. This is the home page. On the right-hand side, you'll see a link that says target-based grading. If you click on that link, it'll take you to a page that gives you all sorts of information. Gives you, videos on what we sent out, flyers for our parents, but most importantly, up in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see K-12 course descriptions and learning targets. There you can click on that, and you can get every single course we offer in our district K through 12. And once you click on the arrows next to any of those topics, you'll see Google links for every single course, and you can click on it, and you can see what we have. Now, the one thing that Tom and I both emphasize is don't just take this and copy it. This is a great starting point for you to have conversations, but the biggest part of this in changing our instruction was the conversations that happen as a result of going through the process. So this is a great starting point, but we highly encourage you, we talk about a process in the book. We talk about how you prioritize the standards and write those targets, but this gives you something you can look at. So then in the last couple minutes here, we just want to kind of show you like assessments, okay? And so we talk about the purpose of assessment, and in a target-based system, the purpose of assessment is evidence gathering. It's nothing more than a means to gather that evidence. So in our case, we develop, we have a 3-2-1 system we use. Now we talk about why you could use different types of systems, whether it's a 4, 3, 2, or 1. What our district, our teachers, and our admin team decided on was we wanted 3 levels of performance, which is what we moved forward with. But then this is really kind of what helped shape our assessments. So this is an assessment template. At the end of the webinar, you'll have my contact information. Feel free to reach out and I can give you a copy of this and you can start to plug it in. But ultimately, you insert the standard. In our case, you insert the learning target. And then you really start to generate questions based on what evidence you need. It's no longer about cut scores of getting 8 questions out of 10 questions correct. It's truly about making sure that the evidence you see from your assessments gives you that information where you can use your professional judgment and make a determination of proficient, approaching, needs support in our case, or whatever system you use. That's really what assessment is for. So an example that we have in here, this is from Becky Pepler from Winneconne High School. As you can see, she has the target listed. I can calculate the number of electrons, protons, and neutrons in an atom, given its atomic number and mass number. Then you can see where there's the opportunity to give a score of 3, 2, or 1, and the feedback. The purpose of this is really to give very clear, specific feedback on where the student's learning is, and then ask whatever questions, have them do whatever performance task you need to be able to work through that. But ultimately, it's really that assessment is about gathering evidence of learning so you can draw on a summative judgment and give that score. Here's another example from Becky. Again, in the book, we have examples from all sorts of different content areas, from social studies to math to, I believe we have ELA examples. There are a variety of examples that we have in there that you can work from. And then the other thing that we just started doing is moving into student self-reported feedback. Having kids assess where they are in their learning, which has really changed the conversation with our students. So the last thing we want to be able to give conversations or give a chance for questions is just to quickly show you what the reporting structures look like. We want to give a few minutes left. So again, as we mentioned, we have 3 levels of performance that are highlighted in the book. That's based on the Winneconne model, but there are a lot of different options that you can choose from. At our elementary school, again, we have the same type of PAW rubric of consistently, sometimes, or rarely. Practice, kindness, hours, show respect, and work to do your best. And then we look at all of the evidence and give our teachers the ability to use their summative judgment based on that evidence that they have in what we use, which is called Mastery Connect. So here's a sample report card. As you can see, we report out on the report card only against domain. And then if those scores are based off of the proficiency scores against all of the learning targets. So you see an example, again, very broad. Here's another one, very broad on the scores that they're given. But let's just say that a parent wants to know more information, or how do our teachers reach those conclusions? As you can see, this is a sample from a software called Mastery Connect with former Green Bay Packer players and some current ones. Our teachers will analyze all of those assessment scores, and then they'll reach a conclusion. So if you're looking at the first player here, Jared Aberderis, you'll look at all of his scores for reading literature. You can say, okay, overall, the student is consistently proficient on those targets. Or you might look at a student like Richard Rogers at the bottom and say, you know what, maybe, probably, sometimes proficient, or rarely, but not necessarily in that consistent range. For our parents, if they want to know why or what those scores are, we also have much more detailed information through this software. Again, you can do this in Google, you can do it in any type of system, but ultimately they can go in and see, in this case, this is from my son, I can see what his particular proficiency scores are for each of those learning targets. Again, see a 2 on language, I can see where his struggles were. At the middle school and high school level, here's what our report cards previously looked like prior to implementing a target-based system. And here's what a progress report looks like now. You can see proficiency scores for each one of those targets, and then you can still see an overall grade. So the one thing that we'll share here before the end is we still chose to keep an academic grade based on our community's expectations. But what we did do was we shifted what that grade represented, which is a result of proficiency. So here's a report card sample. And again, please feel free to email me with any questions on this, knowing that we don't have a lot of time. And I'm happy to share this information with you. Again, you'll get copies of the slides, but I can share some specific examples. But ultimately, again, our students, they are given a score of consistently, sometimes, or rarely on the 3 behavior grades. And then they're also given that academic score. And as I said at the beginning of the webinar, this is now reported on transcripts. So as you can see on this one, you can see not only what is the academic achievement, but what is really the student's approach to learning. And then finally, how do we get there? These are the targets. This is a sample from Skyward. You can do this in PowerSchool. You can do it in Infinite Campus or a lot of other types of SISs out there. But ultimately, parents and students see proficiency scores for each learning target, a 3, 2, or 1. Those learning targets then feed a system, and we take the scale score average. And so what you're seeing here, and we always use most recent evidence, what you're seeing is the left side. Skyward didn't have the ability to give the scale score average, so there's a back side of it that converts it into a percentage, but really what you're looking at is the left side. Those are proficiency. So if you have 10 targets and you're proficient, if you have 3s on 10 of those and you have 2s on 2 of those, that would put you in an A-B range because it would be a scale score average of 2.8. If you're on 9 of them, you would be in the A range. So again, if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out. But ultimately, it's kind of 2 buckets. You have a bunch of proficiency values. You take all of those and you put them into a grade. Now, as you could see, we eliminated pluses and minuses within our system because the levels of difference between all of them were too little. So we moved to an A-B-B system, which flowed well still with the existing GPA structures. And so ultimately, when we laid this out to our community, we showed them, in our case, Wisconsin-Madison, what that looked like in terms of them having A-B-B. And they're like, okay, we're good. We trust you because Madison uses it, and that's kind of the flagship. And so even though our grading structures are much different than the university level, it doesn't represent anything similar. On the surface level, all our parents needed to know was, okay, it looks similar in terms of the output. So with that being said, Tom's going to talk a little bit about embracing the community, and then we still have, I think, about 5 minutes left for questions.
So again, this is a process, not an event. We need to make sure that we are building people's capacity. We need to make sure we're engaging folks in this. Again, when we have purpose, clarity, when it drives everything we are trying to do, if our purpose is as simple and straightforward as we believe all kids can learn, then we must be willing to embrace those things that will ensure all kids learn. We have other stakeholders involved in the system. I want to get us internally on the same page, and then I want to make sure our parents, I've had the good fortune of going to Winneconne and sitting down with parents at a parent meeting, lots of great questions, largely driven by a lack of familiarity, not about a lack of this might be the right thing for us to do. So we've got to be willing to take that on. None of this should happen tomorrow night. You've attended this brilliant webinar, and now you're going to go back to school tomorrow and say, that's it, we're going. No, it's got to take time. Remember what I said earlier, 3 to 5 year process, the building towards to make sure this is sustainable. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we've got a couple of questions before we finish our time here with you.
We want to add is make sure that you bring the community along in that conversation, as Tom mentioned, because the reason why we use the slide is if you keep them in the dark, they will find out and they will rally up the troops, and it will feel like a tornado is coming at your school, and that tornado is often Facebook. Okay, so make sure that you keep your community involved in the conversations so they know what to expect and they understand why you're making those changes. So again, just as a ending point of what we talk about in the book, and again, we give a lot of examples. These are the 4 key areas. But also ultimately, reach out when you have questions. We'll have a little bit of time for some questions right now, but let us know. Email either one of us, and we are happy if we don't get to the questions, or if you have something specifically you want to ask or examples, email us. This is our contact information. We're happy to share. Jeff, are there questions that the last few minutes that we
I do. I have a question, and there were several questions asked, and you answered most of them in the last 10 minutes because they were focused a lot on grades and reporting through course management systems, school management systems. But there is one question. Have you tracked college readiness of the students, comparing those using this method of assessment and those with more traditional ways of assessment? For example, is there a difference in number of students completing 1 year of college? Is there anything that you've done to track college readiness?
So great question, first of all. Part of when I was going through my dissertation, and I did my dissertation on an evaluation of standards-based learning practices specifically to Wisconsin high schools, we looked at high schools that were doing some of this, not doing some of this, and there was a report that comes out in the state every year which looks at remediation rates for students in their freshman year. Now, the one thing that I will say we haven't done is we haven't tracked end of first year success. but we've looked at schools that have implemented these types of systems and how many students needed remedial courses in their first year at the university level. And what I can say specifically to our district, on this particular report, they look at every single high school in the state of Wisconsin, how many students go to one of the University of Wisconsin institutions, and how many of those students need a remedial course in math or English. And you have to have at least 6 that would make, if 6 or more students, you appear on the list. Now, we are fortunate that we have not appeared on the list the last couple years, but we do have schools in our state that are using very traditional practices still, as what I analyzed, that have upwards of 40, 50, or 60% remediation rates for students going to the university their first year. So we don't have the longer term data on after the first year, but we certainly have data about when they leave us and they go, are they better prepared at the university level? And the answer is we feel yes, because they're not needing those remedial courses when they start the university.
So any of you out there looking to do your doctorate, have we got a thesis for you?
Excellent. Very nice. You know, I have one last question. Somebody asked that they're running into parents wanting to see grades on a weekly basis. That's very important to some parents. However, teachers who frequently do summative assessment at the end of a unit might not have grades to show on a weekly basis through the student management system. Is there any recommendations that you have for that?
You want me to start with that, Tom?
Yep.
Okay. You know, so yes, parents, and this is a part of shifting the culture. Ultimately, you know, as you make these changes, parents are used to things looking a certain way. They're used to, in many cases, a lot of the people that might be listening in right now, or Tom or I, they're used to what that looked like, which was you get that immediate grade versus the immediate feedback. So part of it is shifting the culture of our parents and our students to understand that you're still getting that feedback, but it looks different. Now, certainly the student information system, whatever you use, your grade book, whatever it may be, that can be real time. So as a student completes a summative assessment and those scores go in as, you know, in our case, as a 3, 2, or 1, it's automatically going to feed that scale score average. So they will be able to see a grade. The only thing that I highly recommend as you're looking at this system and working through it with your parents is understanding that early in the semester, it may look ugly, okay? Because we haven't necessarily had the opportunity for reassessment to occur and for the additional learning to occur. So one of the things we really had to help our community understand was, all right, we had parents taking away kids' birthdays, and you can't have your license and you can't drive it. And because they weren't doing as well at the start, and we had to help them understand, first and foremost, you know, there might only be 2 or 3 targets in there. And so understand that if you have a lower score on one of those, it's going to impact it. As more evidence comes in, as we go through the learning and the relearning, that will change. And our parents have learned that it's much better as the semester goes. And so you can have your system set up where it's giving that real-time grade. Just help them understand that the relearning needs to occur, and the grades will also then improve as a result of that.
It's that whole formative conversation we talked about earlier that we've also got to educate our parents on, that what you're seeing right now is an indication of where your child is right now, not where they're going to end up. And again, because we have come from a right-wrong dichotomy that many of us have experienced as our schooling, it was that in the moment, and that in the moment became permanent. So as we shift more to formative, to using evidence to guide what happens next, both our instruction and their learning, we're going to have to make sure we educate our parents just as much on that particular facet.
Terrific. That brings us to the end of the questions.
Well, thanks.
Thank you, gentlemen, for a fabulous presentation today. I am a former educator and have spent a great deal of time, including not my dissertation, but my thesis, writing about assessment. And so this really hits home for me. And as a parent, I really appreciate the work that you are spreading and doing, and particularly the people that joined us this evening, and your commitment to being able to provide really true and accurate indicators of students' learning. So on behalf of all of us at Corwin, we want to thank you for joining us. Our next upcoming webinar, and our last one for the 2017-2018 school year, for our spring 2018 season, will be held by David Horton on leading school teams. And I want to remind everyone that We have a newly published book by Hierck and Garth Larson that lays out all of the content that they shared today, including many of the tools that Garth and Tom so generously shared with you as examples of the kinds of work that they're doing in school districts around the country and in Canada as well. A little shout out to Tom there. I want to remind everyone also that you'll be receiving the slides for today as well as a recording of this webinar. And please feel free to use the code that you see on the screen, N185N5, to receive 20% off of Grading for Impact if you order through.
Wow, that's such a deal. You might want to buy 2.
Or maybe 10, I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, the math on that is pretty great, I'm not going to lie. So
that's fabulous.
Well, we hope you have a great rest of your evening and a wonderful week. And thank you again to Tom and Garth for sharing your wisdom and your years of experience with us today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.